All right, welcome to Module 5 of ENVS 505. We're going to be talking about conservation of biodiversity in this module. We'll look at different forms of biodiversity, the values of biodiversity, some threats, areas that have high biodiversity, and then we're going to kind of look at some general principles of conservation biology and how those are used then to conserve species and conserve ecosystems. And since I've taken students on several trips to Belize, I'm going to use a couple of examples from Belize that I think kind of help to illustrate these concepts. So overall, what do we mean when we're talking about biodiversity? You know, we might mean a variety of different things. Usually it's three different things that we mean. Ecosystem diversity, different types of ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds and things like that, each of which would have their own assemblages of species. We might mean genetic diversity. Some populations are inbred and that could cause problems for their reproduction or their continued survival. And then sometimes we mean species diversity, the different types of species found in a system. Now, usually we focus on a concept called species richness, which is how many species are there present within a location. It's easy to understand, it's easy to clarify. There have been 200 birds sighted in this wildlife refuge, for example, 200 species of birds. But it doesn't include how evenly they're distributed and things like that. So ecologists use a number of different techniques, but usually, and again, all of these are important, but usually we focus on species richness, how many species there are. Now, why do we care? Why value biodiversity? You might pause the recording and then write down some reasons why biodiversity is important to you. I came up with this list, or these lists of reasons why biodiversity might be important to different people. First of all, we might care about human life, and ecosystem functions help to support our own skins. We might benefit from medicines that are available from organisms from tropical areas, for example. A lot of medicines that we have are ultimately derived from natural organisms, and so there may be benefit in keeping them because we don't know what medicines are left undiscovered. There might be benefits to agriculture and industry. Sometimes if crops are threatened, you kind of look back at the historic population and maybe you can get some genes that will help them to survive in different types of habitat. Or industry can benefit. Or there might be an aesthetic reasons. We appreciate the beauty of nature and we like to go and visit it. Others might say biodiversity is valuable because species each have a role in the ecosystem. Each organism protects the function of the ecosystem so that other organisms can survive. There might be evolutionary potential. Each species is growing and developing and changing over time, and that might benefit us in the future when the environment changes or climate changes. There might be ethical considerations. We might say each species has its own intrinsic value and it's worth protecting regardless of whether we can assign any monetary value to it. And so those sort of things might be other reasons to protect biodiversity. All in all, the column on the left represents what we call utilitarian values. These are values that are useful to humanity. We can assign a dollar value. We can harvest a natural resource. We can utilize a fish for food. Those are values of ecosystems and species that live in those ecosystems, but they're focused on human values. Versus the columns on the right are more intrinsic value. The organism has a value in and of itself just because it exists, and regardless of any dollar value that we can assign to it. These go along with the different worldviews that we talked about at the start of the course, anthropocentric worldviews and biocentric worldviews. The examples on the left are anthropocentric worldviews. They're human-focused and they're useful to humanity versus biocentric or ecocentric. These are the species have a value because of their role in the ecosystem and because they have an intrinsic value in and of themselves. Now, what are some threats to biodiversity? Habitat loss is a major one. As we decrease the amount of habitat available by deforestation, desertification, urbanization, we decrease the amount of habitat that's available for native species. We also oftentimes will fragment the remaining habitat into smaller and smaller chunks. So this is from a well-studied example in the Amazon where they knew that an area was going to get cleared for cattle farming, and the researchers basically said, let's look at this systematically, where you set aside we have large areas that are set aside, and then we set aside small patches of differing size to see how many species can be supported by that. And it shouldn't be a surprise, but the larger habitat patches ultimately supported more species. So this suggests that if we fragment habitat into smaller and smaller species, certain large ranging species aren't going to be able to survive in any of the patches that are left. Overharvesting and poaching are critically affecting some species like the bluefin tuna, the menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay. And poaching is illegal harvesting. Overharvesting is kind of going beyond what the system can support. Species have the capacity to increase their abundance if they're below the carrying capacity, but if you continue overharvesting them at a high level, it can continue to decrease the population over time, and then the population's so small it can't grow itself. Another threat is invasive species. As we have international commerce and people move around the globe, sometimes species accidentally get introduced into places that they're not native. So they have no known predators within those locations. So for example, the lionfish at the top, it's native to the Western Pacific, but it's accidentally been introduced in Florida and the Caribbean, and it's just absolutely decimated some of the wild fish populations because they're not used to this voracious predator living there. And with its venomous spines and poison, there's not a whole lot of organisms that can eat it. Some can, but it is pretty well protected from other things. So it's gotten to be really abundant in certain locations and has decimated native fish populations. At the bottom, we have the newly invaded spotted lanternfly, which is affecting forests on the East Coast and is projected to spread out throughout the area. Some people have been advocating really strongly that if you see one of these, you ought to smash it, you ought to destroy their eggs to stop them from spreading. But really, anytime you've introduced an invasive species that's capable of rapid population growth, it's really hard to close Pandora's box after it's been accidentally introduced into a location. So they have things like lionfish spearfishing tournaments, which do help to reduce the population a little bit, but ultimately it hasn't caused them to go locally extinct within that area. That would take an incredible amount of effort. Pollutants can have effects on organisms. They're a form of environmental degradation, and especially now we're mindful of the way that climate change is impacting species, such as polar bears. Their amount of habitat is going to be reduced. They rely on ice pack for hunting, so they can basically wait around the breathing holes and wait for a seal to come up, and then they can capture their prey. If the ice comes off the northern latitudes earlier and there's less of an ice pack, there's more of the time during the year where they have a harder time procuring food. So it's led to starvation in some organisms, and the polar bear is projected to be one of the first species that's dramatically impacted by climate change. Now, where are the areas of high biodiversity? Okay, if you had limited conservation dollars and you wanted to buy land in order to save native ecosystems, where would you be best investing your money? So Myers and colleagues in 2000 published a high-profile article in Nature that kind of identified these 25 hotspots. They looked at things like plant diversity, bird diversity, mammal diversity, and they identified these locations that if you could spend your conservation dollars, these would be the best places to spend your money because they have a high biodiversity, they have a unique biodiversity, a lot of endemic species only found there and nowhere else, and these populations are under threat because of human population growth within these areas. So these would be areas where we would be wise to invest our biodiversity dollars to conserve land and species. Now, what do these areas have in common? Well, many of these areas are in tropical locations. Tropical locations tend to be a lot more diverse than polar areas. That's not to say we shouldn't conserve areas near the poles, but if you want to conserve a greater amount of biodiversity on the planet, more of that exists in tropical areas. Likewise, a lot of islands have unique forms of life living in those habitats. Think of the lemurs of Madagascar that live nowhere else in the world. A lot of islands have unique flora and fauna in these locations, and therefore, because they can evolve in isolation and develop into new species on the islands, a lot of times islands have high biodiversity that's unique. Likewise, this last category, number 1, number 9, number 12, and what is that, 21, all have an area that's known as either Mediterranean or chaparral. There's other terms for this habitat. But basically it receives, it's very dry, but one step up from a desert, and it receives the vast majority of its rainfall in the winter time. So I grew up in Southern California. This area had brown hillsides most of the year, but then December, January, February, the hills would kind of perk up and be green, and there'd be a lot of plants growing because of the winter rains within those locations. So these areas will have, for some reason, that makes plant diversity just absolutely go crazy, and there's lots and lots of diversity of plants within these locations. Unique forms only found in those locations. So the plants found in 1 are not found in 9 or not found in 12. Each of those areas has its own unique plant assemblages. And for example, the picture on the lower left, this is from Leo Carrillo State Beach, which is kind of west of Malibu, and basically this plant in the front is called giant coreopsis. It basically lives from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara right along the coast, and that's the only place on the planet that it's found. If you go 20 miles out to the Channel Islands, you might find other rare plants found there, each of which is only found on one particular island or on the sides of cliffs on the mainland or things like that. My botany professor used to take us for hikes in an area called Wildwood near Thousand Oaks, California, and every time we'd find multiple species that were endemic to the area and on the endangered species list just because there's such vast biodiversity in these locations. Now in the U.S., as I mentioned, Hawaii, high biodiversity because of islands. Each island has its own unique form sometimes. Very rare species, especially on the western Hawaiian Islands, which are the older ones that have had longer to evolve. That California floristic province, including San Diego, there's a lot of rare and unique plants there. Some of the Channel Islands you can see near number 5. Also, the San Francisco Bay Area has a lot of unique fish species and plant species and things like that. And then near number 4, this is near Death Valley, and for example, the Devil's Hole pupfish lives in that area, and within maybe a 20-mile range or a 50-mile range, there might be a dozen species of pupfish, each in its own isolated spring, plus rare and unique plants. Now on the East Coast, for some reason, the panhandle of Florida has lots of rare and unique plants. And in Virginia, Western Virginia is actually a hot spot for certain types of plants living in fens and glades and bogs. It's also the world hotspot for freshwater mussel biodiversity, and it has high biodiversity of freshwater fish called darters. Each of the different watersheds can have its own species of clams or mussels, and the darter species, the fish species that kind of goes along with it. The clams can parasitize the fish when they're in the larval form. So each form in a different watershed can then lead to formation of new species. Now, I want to give you some general principles of conservation biology because these are going to be important when we consider how to conserve them. As biologists, a lot of times we'll think of populations, individual populations. So on the left-hand side, these would be the little green patches, each of which has its own population. But really we want to think beyond a population and what we call a meta-population. So this example on the chart shows 6 different habitat patches, 5 of which have individuals in them, and the extra individuals can actually move from patch to patch. So they're not just confined to their area, they can potentially move and then occupy the others. So we might think of this as what's called a source sink model. The 2 that have high density, those are what we call source populations, high quality habitat, good reproduction, high individual biomass, and then excess reproduction. So the extra individuals then will migrate out to the other habitat patches, which might be a sink habitat patch, a low quality one, or an unoccupied patch might end up with some of the extra individuals. And then we might consider these metapopulations within a landscape. What are the habitat corridors that connect them and allow for dispersal from one habitat patch to another? This also relates to a concept called island biogeography theory. You might ask, what affects how diverse an island is? How many species can exist on an island? Well, the model for this basically is a balance between immigration and extinction. So it's immigration of new species that then arrive on the island, and then extinction of existing species. If you start on the x-axis to the left at a low number of species on the island, you'll see you have a high value for immigration on the y-axis and a low value for extinction. That's because any new species that reaches the island is going to be a new species, but there's not a whole lot of species there, so there's not a lot of competition, and the population will do well. But as the number increases, the extinction rate goes up and the immigration of new species goes down until it reaches an equilibrium number where immigration and extinction balance each other out. So what factors could impact immigration and extinction on different types of islands or different types of habitat patches? How about island size? How about the distance from shore? What are some ways that these might potentially impact how diverse the system is? What about some other factors? Maybe the different types of plants that there are on the island, how many different resources and how many different niches there are. All of those could be important. So let's look at a couple of these. So first of all, the distance effect on the left-hand side. You might think of 2 identical islands, one very, very close to the mainland, one further from the mainland. It's not hard to imagine that more species could colonize the near one because they don't have to go over as much barren habitat, in this case the water, so the birds can fly over and then make their way there, or insects can fly over. But if you have that island too far, some of the insects might not make it to the far island. They might die and fall into the ocean or something like that, and only a few species colonize. So you might find more species on islands that are closer to the mainland. Likewise, if you have a large island versus a small island, that can affect immigration because more species can make it. It's a bigger target out there in the ocean, so you're going to have more immigration because it's simply a larger habitat. Likewise, you're going to have lower amounts of extinction on an island that's larger. So of the 6 species on the right-hand column, of the 6 species that colonized the big island, 2 went extinct, but 4 remained, survived because there's a variety of different habitats. Versus on the small island, 3 species made it there, but 2 then went extinct because there was competition among the different species. So this differential amount of extinction and immigration can affect how many species there are. So coming back to our model, we might consider, what about small islands versus large islands? Small islands would have a higher curve for extinction and a lower curve for immigration because of the reasons that we've talked about on the previous slide. In contrast, a large island has a higher immigration rate, it's a bigger target, and a lower extinction rate. So if you compare where these lines cross, for small islands, look at the intersection between the extinction rate and the immigration rate. It is the low triangle on the x-axis. Versus the large island, the extinction curve and the immigration curve intersect at a higher value. So a large island can support a higher biomass because there's more immigration and lower extinction relative to on a small island. Now, this is important for actual islands, but this is also important for habitat reserves or national parks or national wildlife refuges where it's a good habitat that's set aside for wildlife. And these principles then are used by wildlife managers in order to conserve habitat and protect as many species as possible. Now, the approach to conserve biodiversity basically falls into two categories, a species approach and an ecosystem approach. Species approach, as the name suggests, focuses on individual species. You identify endangered species, protect the habitat that they need, and you do that by legally protecting them, the Endangered Species Act, managing their habitat, maybe captive breeding, maybe reintroduction, but the focus is on one individual species that's imperiled. Versus an ecosystem approach, you set aside land, you set aside marine habitats, you protect the whole ecosystem, native populations in their natural habitat, whether they're endangered or not. And if you save enough areas of different habitats in different biomes, different aquatic systems, protect them through private purchase, government action, you want to manage them well. Eliminate invasive species, manage the areas to sustain native species, and restore degraded habitats, then you can help to save the ecosystem. So the focus for that is on the ecosystem versus a species by species approach. Both are important, both are valuable, but I just want you to kind of focus on how are they managing these different habitats. And in reality, we kind of have to do a little bit of both. So a species approach to conservation is the Endangered Species Act. We've got some videos this week that look at the Endangered Species Act as a piece of legislation, 40 years old, and what it conserves. In a nutshell, it conserves endangered and threatened species. So endangered is worse than threatened. That means it's in danger of going extinct. Threatened means it's in danger of becoming endangered. The Endangered Species Act protects species or subspecies in all or part of the range. So it could be rare in one location. So the bald eagles were rare in the lower 48 states, but they were abundant in Alaska. Doesn't matter, they're still protected in the lower 48 states. And it can be a subspecies. So the clapper rail on the East Coast, it can be hunted, but there's certain subspecies, now I believe they're full species of clapper rail on the West Coast that are actually rare and endangered because there's not very many wetland habitats there, not a lot of salt marsh available in those locations because of urbanization. Now we have federal lists and state lists, so it's the federal government's list, but if the federal government doesn't choose to list a species, you have 50 states that could potentially protect it, at least within the boundaries of their state. And these also protect critical habitats. So this green sea turtle that I took a photo of, this was in Belize, and 6 of the 7 species of sea turtle are on the endangered species list and are protected. We also have a couple of other lists. The CITES list, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, basically prevents commerce. You can't sell green sea turtle shells, for example. And the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, publishes a red list of threatened species. These are more global approaches in order to conserve habitat, but it's kind of a multi-tiered approach to saving species. So let me give you a few examples of how the Endangered Species Act protects specific species. This is the red cock-headed woodpecker. It's native to longleaf pine forests in the southeastern United States, and because those areas are over-harvested and because we've stopped fire in these forests, these are actually on the endangered species list. Now, the ideal habitat is like we see in the middle here, where you can see the forest fires have kind of cleared out the underbrush. You can see the trees are kind of resistant to small fires. You can see kind of the burns along the base there, but this kind of clears out the canopy so the bird can easily fly from one to another and have its nest in longleaf pine areas. In contrast, an overgrown forest where fire is not permitted, basically there's overgrowth and the woodpeckers don't choose that habitat because they can't easily fly from one area to another. So that's the Endangered Species Act. There's legal protection for them. It's illegal. You can have a fine if you harm or damage one. But in some places, they have then gone to try to conserve them and add nest boxes because they don't drill out their own cavities. So some researchers got the idea of if you cut a hole within the longleaf pine and you insert a nest box, you can basically increase the amount of nesting cavities. And so they've used that to give it a jump start, and it's actually on the rebound as a result of these efforts. The first test of the Endangered Species Act as a law was the snail darter. This is kind of a 2-inch long fish that lived in the Tennessee Valley, and its only known habitat was in an area where they were going to complete a dam called the Tellico Dam. And once it lives in fast-flowing waters, and that's it, not in still-flowing waters. So once they completed the dam, the river would get converted into a lake, and the snail darter would not have any of its native habitats. So they basically they sued on behalf of a 2-inch long fish in order to protect it. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and surprisingly, the Supreme Court actually found for the snail darter. Basically said this law applies to all species, not just the warm and fuzzy, cute and cuddly species. So Congress then had to pass another law that basically circumvented this and said the Endangered Species Act applies, but just not to the Tellico Dam. And they basically then did a wider survey, found more populations of snail darter that lived in other places, and then they took the ones that were going to be inundated, they moved them to other habitats. So right now the snail darter's actually living and thriving still, despite us building that dam in that location and completing the dam shortly after the passage of the Endangered Species Act. Another favorite example of mine of an endangered species that's protected is the American burying beetle. This is a 2-inch long, 1.5 to 2-inch long beetle that actually will take dead carcasses of animals like dead squirrels and dead birds, and the male and the female work together and dig a hole and then kind of cover up this dead carcass. They lay their eggs on the carcass, and then as the grubs hatch, they basically devour this rotting carcass that's then been buried underground by their parents. Now, these used to be much more abundant when we had the passenger pigeon, but since the passenger pigeon went extinct, there's fewer carcasses for them, and their populations have gotten isolated with habitat fragmentation and things like that. So now there's only a handful of different populations in several states, but this bug is receiving your tax dollars to try to conserve it and keep it from going extinct. Now, an example from Belize. I promised a couple of Belize examples to illustrate these. This is the Belize harpy eagle, largest bird in Belize. Large raptor was was killed, and there was habitat fragmentation and a lot of reasons for its demise. But at the Belize Zoo, they have conducted a captive breeding effort where they're raising them in captivity, growing them, and then reintroducing them to different parts of their habitat that they formerly existed. And this is helping the species to get a foothold back into certain parts of Central America. Now, an ecosystem approach, in contrast, focuses on saving an ecosystem. So it's a quote, the wildlife preserves example to conservation. Now, you might think of Yellowstone National Park and Grand Tetons National Park. These are habitats set aside primarily for wildlife. They have places where people can visit, but primarily a lot of these areas are wilderness areas. And you think about a grizzly bear. Grizzly bear doesn't know when the park ends, and so we have to kind of consider how are these parks linked together because they're in close proximity, but also how far might a grizzly bear wander, and what can we do in the surrounding areas to help conserve them. This has led to the development of a concept called the Biosphere Reserve, or the Man and Biosphere Reserve, where we set aside core areas of habitat, but then have them surrounded by buffer zones to enlarge them, sort of like island biogeography, where you want to have a larger and larger habitat. So having the areas where humans are impacting, but having that be part of the buffer zone around the core area of wilderness habitat, you can still have human settlements, you can still have research and tourism, but in a way that then protects the core area and basically expands the functionality of it beyond that core. A good example of ecosystem conservation is along the eastern shore of Virginia. All of the barrier islands are basically owned for conservation purposes, and it's by a variety of different ones. So this is protecting sufficient areas of habitat, the coastal dunes, the salt marsh habitats, the barrier island habitats, and these are protected through private purchase or through government action. So the ones in dark green are Nature Conservancy preserves, privately held. The Nature Conservancy owns them, and they can keep people out of those islands. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries and Virginia DCR own several of the other habitats. And then up the northern areas, Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, Eastern Shore National Wildlife Refuge down at the south, Fisherman's Island National Wildlife Refuge at the south, and Eastern Shore National Wildlife Refuge is another part of it there. Areas on Assawoman Island, Wallops Island, etc. The whole coast of the eastern shore of Virginia is under some level of protection, but it's a combination of federal, state, and private land holdings. Within those areas, they're working to eliminate non-natives, restore native habitats, manage the area for these species that normally inhabit those areas, and restore some degraded ecosystems. So that's an ecosystem approach. Now, this is basically the application of island biogeography theory. You might ask yourself, why are the ones on the left in green better than the ones on the right? So for the first one, it's larger. Bigger is better because of island biogeography theory. Bigger islands can hold more species, so bigger habitat reserves can hold more species. Likewise, if you take the same amount of habitat and have one large one versus 4 fragmented habitats, the one large one actually does better in terms of conserving biodiversity. Then likewise, you might think about the proximity in C and D by having the reserves close to each other and interconnected rather than widely spaced apart or kind of linearly arranged where for D on the right-hand side, the habitat on the left, species can only easily migrate to the next particular habitat, versus the 4 on the left, each can migrate to 3 other habitats. And then if you consider ways that they're interconnected and you provide buffer strips or habitat corridors, that does a better job. And then having round habitats versus elongated ones with more surface area or more edge. Some species like the brown-headed cowbird, it's a brood parasite and it will lay its eggs in warblers' nests. So if you're conserving for warblers, you need to have dense forest that's surrounded by a lot of other native forest, because the cowbird can come in and parasitize the nests that are along the edge. And so if you have an oval shape, then the majority of that is edge and there's not very much core area, versus a large round one can protect the area in the middle. Now, looking at a couple of Belize examples of the ecosystem approach. The Central Belize Corridor, this is an area where there are several large areas of habitat set aside that protect jaguars, among other things, where these are large enough, suitable for jaguars, but you have to think about how do they get from place to place. And so by considering this habitat corridor, they can actually promote jaguars moving from one area to the other in order to improve genetic diversity and stop inbreeding. And along the Western Highway there, near the place where the arrow tip is, there's actually signs along the road, watch for jaguars crossing the highway, and they encourage people to slow down in those locations. Likewise, in southern Belize, the area that is just adjacent to that includes Chiquiboule National Park, Bladen Reserve, Columbia River Reserve, etc., all as a large contiguous habitat, and the Mountain Pine Ridge Reserve that can support jaguars. But then the jaguars need to move down into the habitats that are in Guatemala and Honduras along the southern Belize corridor. So this is a way of kind of thinking of how are these large patches of habitat interconnected, and what can we do to promote species moving from habitat to habitat. And then finally, the marine reserves. Belize has a vast network of marine reserves all up and down the coast. I'm going to focus on the northeastern portion of the country. The first area that they protected was A, B, and C, which is the Hol Chan Marine Reserve. And B is an area of seagrasses. C is an area of mangrove islands and things like that. So what they did was they said to the fishermen that we're going to basically lose out on some of their fishing grounds. Don't fish in A. We want to set aside A as a prime habitat, but we're going to let you keep fishing in B, and that's where the queen conch is. So this is a large snail. They make conch ceviche out of it. The conch populations are actually doing really well in Belize. And so as long as you don't harvest in A, we can let you harvest in B forever. And we're not going to sell any new fishing licenses. So if you have a fishing license, over time, the fishing is only going to get better and better as you have fewer and fewer competitors. So the fishermen saw an economic interest in this, and they agreed to set this area aside as a reserve. And then they added Shark Ray Alley, which is D, and there's a no-take zone. There's other zones adjacent to that. And so in the areas that are in blue, you basically can't touch the wildlife. You can't harvest anything. If you're diving, you can't even wear gloves. And they have game wardens that will basically police the area to make sure that everybody agrees to the rules and abides by the rules. You have to pay an extra fee to dive in those locations because there's more biodiversity, there's larger fish, there's more rare fish within those locations. And the populations do well, and the surplus population then spills over and has a positive effect on the other dive sites. So since then, they've expanded it. For G and H at the top, this is Mexico Rocks, and they've decided to add that as a protected area. It has a few kind of isolated patch reefs and kind of a deep cave. That area is protected, but they also have the buffer zone around it, G, where there's kind of limited general use within that area, but you need a special permit to be in H. And they've also added some of the other conservation zones shown on this in order to protect a wide variety of different habitat types. So this is a good example of marine conservation and an ecosystem approach. So in conclusion, we looked at different forms of biodiversity: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. All three are important. Ultimately, we focus on species diversity. We looked at different ways that they're threatened, areas of high biodiversity, especially with endemic species, rare, that only live in one place. We looked at the basic principles of conservation biology, including metapopulations and island biogeography theory, and then how that's used for conservation. We especially focused on the species approach, the Endangered Species Act, and the ecosystem approach through habitat conservation, federal government or private or state government, and I used a couple of Belize examples. Thanks.